Welcome. My name's Paul Mills. I'm the chair of the board of the Jubilee Centre, Christian think tank in the UK, and we are in collaboration with Salux, particularly with some of the webinars we're doing this year. And so it's a great pleasure to introduce Matthew Ferguson, who's another trustee of the Jubilee Centre, but is also a solicitor currently in Edinburgh, but I understand moving to London in the new year. So coming to the big smoke. It's a great pleasure to introduce him, as he's written for us quite extensively on the demographic crisis that many countries are facing. And so tonight's seminar is particularly going to be focused on the EU's sort of how it might have a family-centered solution to its demographic problems. Countries are scratching their heads about policy measures as to how to try and raise birth rates, given the aging and in many cases shrinking populations in Europe, but also in Asia as well. And so countries have been experimenting with different policies around childcare or fiscal incentives for marriage and so on, but not many are sort of working, and certainly not many are turning round the falling birth rates. And so this is a context that we're holding a seminar in to try and generate debate and interest in how to do this in the EU. So I'll hand over to Matthew now, and we'll, just to note, he'll speak for roughly half an hour. There'll be then questions afterwards, and if you'd like to write out the question in the Q&A as it arises, I can then sort of scan those and feed them to Matthew. If there's opportunity, we may well just call on people to ask them in person as well. But initially, if you could write questions in the Q&A, and I'll filter those. So over to Matthew, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you very much to everyone who's attending here today for such an important discussion. I'll just wait a second for Ruben, if you're able to share the slides before I get started. Perfect. So yes, as Paul said, today's topic is a family-centered Europe as the solution to demographic decline. Next slide, please, Ruben. So what is the most serious challenge faced by Europe this century? Is it climate change, Russian aggression, mass migration, or even far left or far right politics? How many would volunteer the answer of demographic decline? Perhaps not as many. However, it is increasingly clear that rapidly falling birth rates across Europe threaten the greatest disruption to our continent. So what do I mean by demographic decline? Demographic decline, technically, is the transitional state between a large population and a smaller one, where a sustained fall in births results in a lopsided society with a growing number of elderly people, but a shrinking number of workers and providers. Already, we are seeing the early symptoms of this. Rising state debt and expenditure on old age pensions, record immigration to fill vacancies, creaking health services with millions-long waiting lists, and so on. Now, these issues do have several causes, but politicians have been slow to identify the influence of the demographic factor. Next slide, please, Ruben. Consider this map for a second, which shows countries across the world according to their total fertility rate, TFR, which means the average number of children born to women of childbearing age. For a population to remain stable, the TFR must be 2.1 children per woman, known as the replacement rate. On this map on the slide, countries tinted red, orange, and beige have a TFR below 2.1, which means they don't produce enough children to sustain populations through births alone. Now, note how astonishingly widespread this is. Not a single European country produces enough children. India, now the world's biggest country, too few kids. Three of the four biggest Muslim countries, Indonesia, Bangladesh, and Turkey, as well as Catholic South America, all below replacement levels. Next slide, please, Ruben. This map here gives the European TFR averages from 2023 and 2024, from what we have so far. Red shows the most extreme decline, while only the dark greens have TFRs above replacement levels. This map is equally startling. Every single European country is well below replacement rates. The best performers in this map being Montenegro and Bulgaria at 1.79 are not even close to 2.1. And who would have thought that three of the worst performers would be the Catholic strongholds of Italy, Spain, and Poland? Next slide, please, Ruben. However, it's not the case that all European leaders have been ignorant of demographic decline. Prime ministers like Italy's Giorgia Meloni and Hungary's Viktor Orban have been vexed by the threat of falling birth rates. In Hungary's case, the government has been spending 5% of GDP annually in combating decline. Measures include abolishing income tax for mothers of 3 children, free IVF treatment, interest-free loans to married couples, and even childcare grants to grandparents. Although these subsidies caused an initial spike to Hungary's TFR, as you can see, it has again dropped below the EU average. Meanwhile, countries like Sweden, with their famously generous welfare state, fare little better. Despite parents enjoying 480 days of shared parental leave and heavily subsidized nurseries, its TFR is 1.45 and falling. Nothing so far has worked. In a previous seminar with the Jubilee Centre, I spoke about the implications of demographic decline. Strained public services, staffing shortages in health and social care, loneliness epidemics, spiraling government debt, tension between young and old, and even dystopian scenarios like incentivized euthanasia. In today's discussion, however, my aim is to provide an in-depth look at the causes and solutions to demographic decline in Europe. Next slide, please, Ruben. Now, it's useful to begin with a summary of why populations rise and fall, briefly. You may recall from your school days that there were 4 stages to demographic transition. Before the Industrial Revolution, human populations grew only very slowly. Although women had on average over 6 children, deaths from infant and maternal mortality were very high. However, with industrialization, modern medicine, and widespread literacy, material conditions improved and deaths fell sharply, the second stage. This caused populations to surge. In time, as fewer babies died, families began having fewer children, the third stage. But since life expectancy continued to lengthen, populations still increased. Only in the fourth stage, with fertility rates around 2.1, did populations stabilize. This was supposed to be the end of demographic history. However, it turns out there was a 5th stage of demographic decline. Fertility rates did not level off at 2.1, rather, over the world, they kept falling. Next slide, please, Ruben. As shown earlier, demographic decline is not confined to any part of the world. 2/3 of the world's population today live in countries with TFRs below replacement levels. The United Nations estimates that 30 countries will see their populations halve by 2100, including Spain, Japan, Italy, China, and Thailand. Thailand is a particularly interesting case, with a TFR of 1.2, but a GDP per capita of only $7,500 a year. A still developing country whose population is aging before it gets rich. Historically, this is unheard of. But even poorer countries, like the Philippines, are on the same path. This dispels the notion that economics and finance is the sole or even primary mover of demographic decline. Rather, it is just the tip of the iceberg. Other forces of decline are at play. Now, what are these forces causing demographic decline? These are any influences which discourage, hinder, or complicate the decision to have children. The forces are multiple and open-ended, but a useful way to categorize them is with the acronym crises: cultural, religious, ideological, social, and only finally, economic. At the top of the iceberg here are economic forces that the politicians most readily respond to. And often this is the only force we see. If only we could give every young couple a 3-bedroom flat and 100,000 euros in cash, that would fix it. But this is misguided because we miss the plethora of other forces beneath the surface. Just a handful of examples, as you can see on the slide here. Next slide, please, Ruben. As the proverb goes, it takes a village to raise a child. Now, what is meant by this will be obvious to any parent. Despite its joys, raising children demands vast amounts of time, effort, and attention, normally over 2 or more decades. Therefore, the historical norm was for entire extended families to be involved in childcare. Aunts, uncles, sisters, cousins, grandparents, and even beyond that. This is one of the core reasons why the Old Testament emphasized so strongly the need for proximately located extended families. However, changes beginning with wide-scale urbanization following the agricultural revolution caused the dispersal of extended families and formed a new grouping, nuclear families, meaning mum, dad, and 2 kids with occasional visits from the grandparents. This substantially increased the childcare required of parents. Yet the splintering of families did not stop there. Geographic mobility, that means people moving away from their community of birth, has continued apace. This is the case both between EU countries and within them. The European Commission reported that in 2023, 10 million working-age EU citizens moved to live in a different EU country. Eastern and Southern European countries in particular are draining young people. In 2020, around 18% of Romanians and Croatians and 10% of Portuguese lived in another EU state. Uncoincidentally, these are the parts of Europe with the steepest declines in TFR. Domestic mobility is starker yet. In northwestern European countries like Sweden, Denmark, and the UK, between 30 and 40% of people moved houses within the last 5 years. College and university graduates are most likely to move. In the UK, 35% of graduates and 15% of non-graduates had moved away from where they lived age 16, with a quarter of graduates moving to London. Indeed, despite already being highly urbanized, the EU is seeing increased moves to big cities. Currently, 75% of EU citizens live in cities, projected to rise to 84% by 2050. What impact does this have? In short, people become more socially atomized, insecure, and isolated from family and community support structures. What was the historical rarity has now become common: single occupancy households. In Scotland, nearly 1 million people live alone, 37% of all households. In the EU, single-person households increased by 21% in the last decade, with 73 million people living alone. This has profound implications for childbearing. As young people leave behind families for education and work, they lose the practical and relational support that families provide. The small, expensive homes and precarious rental living in cities does not provide a suitable abode for big families. Moreover, the anonymity and dearth of stable local communities mean that family support structures are impossible to replace, leading to widespread loneliness. The isolation and lack of support many young couples feel is certainly being caused by these mobility trends. This is a particularly tricky issue in the EU, where any limitation to the idea of free movement would be a non-starter politically. Next slide, please, Ruben. A related issue is the lack of time people seem to find in the 21st century. As Dr. Michael Schluter likes to say, time is the currency of relationships, and he's right. Raising children is as much a question of time as of money and practical support. Many people today feel distracted and inundated by calls on their attention, with little spare time for children. A UK survey showed that in the past year, 74% of people experienced stress that overwhelmed their ability to cope. That being said, working hours actually have steadily decreased over time. The average EU worker works 36 hours a week, with the Dutch working the fewest at 32.4. However, our working culture has radically changed, especially since COVID. The onset of remote or home working has been a double-edged sword. Although it has reduced commuting times, it has blurred or even eradicated the boundary between work and family time. 57% of workers report feeling the need to give 24/7 availability to their bosses. Flexible working has made it difficult to shut off, with email alerts buzzing from work phones often through the night. Several European countries have introduced right to disconnect laws, which variously prohibit bosses contacting workers out of hours. However, with the exception of Portugal, these laws lack teeth. Another change is more fundamental: the need for two incomes to raise households. Women's labour force participation has surged in the EU from 57% in 1995 to over 70% today. Although, of course, a cause for celebration, this has substantively altered the social fabric. In economic terms, an increase in the number of workers mean that each worker is worth less, i.e. earns less. Combined with rising housing and childcare costs, this has made it almost impossible to raise a large family on a single income, bar a handful of professions like law, medicine, and finance. Having it all was the popular catchphrase of the 1990s, where women were not limited to domestic life or career, but could choose both. Increasingly, however, having it all is daunting. A frantic vision of juggling full-time work, school runs, children's activities, domestic chores, elderly parents, and little time for much else. All of this makes the idea of having children seem impossible. We simply can't find time for ourselves, never mind a newborn. Next slide, please, Ruben. One significant trend in fertility is the increasingly later age of parenthood. In 1970, the average British woman welcomed her first child aged 23. Today, over half of British women are childless at 30. The EU average is similar at 29.7. But this is only part of the story. What we see in Europe is a shift towards not just older parents, but delayed adulthood. While historically youths became socially and economically independent in their early 20s, today we see adolescents effectively pushed into mid-20s and even later. Young people remain dependent on parents and the state for far longer. The number of British 18-year-olds attending tertiary education is over 50% and rising, including 57% of women. The EU average is at 43%. This means spending 3, 4 years or even more relying on parental income or student loans. Even once students graduate, many don't find jobs in their area of training, and those who do face stagnant wages and expensive rents. As a result, young people remain dependents well beyond the age of legal adulthood, sometimes literally. The majority of Italian men stay with their parents until 31. This matters for demographic decline because women's fertility begins dropping sharply at 32, as you can see on the slide. According to demographer Stephen Shaw, if a woman is childless at 30, her chances of ever becoming a mother are 50-50. Two of the best predictors of whether someone will have children is that they are 1, married, and 2, young. However, European societies and culture have transformed such that marrying and having children in one's 20s is the exception, not the rule. Indeed, across many of the forces of decline, this is the crux. Modern society has transformed radically, but our biological realities and needs remain the same. Although our educational and economic and social structures mean we often do not attain adulthood until our 30s, our fertility clocks tick as they always have. This means young Europeans spend their most fertile years tied up in pursuits not conducive towards childbearing. Now, of course, this is not their fault as such, nor is this change exclusively negative. It would be unfair to say so. But if we are to reverse demographic decline, we must confront delayed adulthood head-on, particularly in tertiary education and housing policy. Next slide, please, Ruben. One of the central cultural transformations in recent years has been in the relationship between men and women. It's self-evident and obvious to say our demographic fate depends on there being an abundance of marriageable men and women to form families. However, increasing evidence shows there is something broken in how men and women relate. In Europe, we have witnessed a breakdown in the God-given institution designed for raising families, marriage. Raising children, sorry, marriage. The number of people marrying continues to fall, with the lowest EU marriage rates found in Italy, Portugal, and France. At the same time, divorce rates remain stubbornly high. Around 45% of marriages in the EU end in divorce, with far higher averages across Western Europe. Dating has also been affected. High and frequent geographic mobility, the splintering of local communities, and the development of digital platforms have revolutionized dating. Whereas previously people met spouses through family introductions, church and local communities, or the workplace, today the most common way couples meet is online, specifically on apps. This is called the dating market, and the clue is in the name. While it is true that good marriages have started on these apps, on the whole, they have had a profoundly negative impact on the dating culture. By displaying abundance of choice, appealing to superficial characteristics, and discouraging commitment, the apps have generated a culture of casual, serial relationships. Dating apps' financial model depends on relationships not being successful. Singles must flock back to the apps. The common tale is of young people dating round in circles. Clashing intentions, predatory behaviors, and an infinity of choice lead to unrealistic expectations in partners. The result is wasted years on the dating market, with particularly difficulties in finding someone with shared values on marriage and children. Little wonder 80% of young people report being fatigued by dating apps. Dating anxieties are compounded by growing disparities in the prospects and values of men and women. Women's entrance into the workforce and attainment of equal rights are, of course, wonderful achievements, not suggesting otherwise. However, what we are seeing now is actually unprecedented. Young women are beginning to overtake men across educational, career, and social metrics. In the EU, 48% of women aged 25 to 34 hold tertiary education degrees, compared to 37% of men, and it keeps widening. The effects are now filtering through to the job market. In the UK, the female employment rate among 20s is 3 points higher than the male. Since 2022, young British women out-earn young men. However, this is not just a story of women moving forwards. It would be fine if that was just the case. But young men are actively moving backwards, especially men without degrees. The number of young men withdrawing from work and society has soared since 2010. These clashing fortunes have been a disaster for dating. Yale University anthropologist Marcia Inhorn has identified what she calls a mating gap experienced by young women. Young women today, highly educated, career-driven, financially independent, find a dearth of young men matching their attainments. Historically, women have sought out partners of equal or higher social status than themselves. However, with women today outperforming men, there is a shortage of eligible suitors. Dr. Inhorn writes that this has been a significant driver of young women freezing their eggs, buying time to find a partner. Indeed, in surveys of young adults, not having found a partner consistently ranks as a top reason for not having had children. Europe must find a way to restore ties between the sexes. Next slide, please, Ruben. Now, each of these causes illustrate just how deeply seated and multifaceted and complicated demographic decline is. They explain why economic solutions favored by European politicians have largely failed. What is needed is a comprehensive approach that tackles each force of decline. Now, we will look at some relationship-centered solutions to these forces. Although the impact of economic forces on fertility is overstated, to be clear, financial pressures do remain a core force of decline. In fact, even if we were to counteract the other forces, young couples are still unlikely to have large families if they cannot afford them. family-friendly government subsidies and legislation will be a central part of raising birth rates. Generous state grants to young couples in Hungary and parental protections in Sweden did initially boost fertility rates. Sadly, these improvements weren't sustained. However, other EU countries will look to emulate their policies to more enduring effect. For instance, although improvements in Hungary's birth rates have stalled, the country has seen reliable increases to its marriage rate, which now tops the EU. This bodes well for Hungary's trajectory, as marriage is among the best predictors of fertility in the long term. These policies are a wake-up call for countries like the UK, which remain asleep at the wheel in responding to fertility decline. Tax incentives to marry in the UK are almost non-existent, while child support is lacking and inaccessible to many. Government policy regarding free childcare, for instance, has been motivated not to help families have more children, but to get both parents, mum and dad, back to work. Although GDP growth is of course important, British and European governments must remember that relational priorities are equally, if not more, important and provide support accordingly. And there'll be no economy if we have an existential crisis of shrinking populations in the future. Next slide, please, Ruben. A solution with immense potential for not only improving the birth rate, but also addressing elderly care and loneliness is the co-location of families. Co-location means enabling extended family members to move within geographic proximity of one another. Excessive mobility and breakdown of local communities has evaporated traditional support structures, leaving young families isolated and exhausted. Meanwhile, elderly citizens suffer unprecedented loneliness and poor health, with local governments facing bankruptcy and funding their ballooning care needs. Co-location channels the God-given strengths of families, restores local communities, and alleviates tax burdens. As is self-evident, having grandparents, siblings, and cousins nearby provides numerous benefits to childbearing, practical and relational. The only high-income country with a TFR above replacement levels is Israel. Now, Israel is in some ways a demographic enigma, with the legacy of the Holocaust, geopolitical challenges, and some of the peculiarities of Judaism contributing to a pronatal culture. However, one of the recognized contributors to Israel's demographic success is the country's small size, meaning relatives are never far away to provide support. Government policy can incentivize families to co-locate. The Singaporean government offers subsidies and tax reliefs. For example, the proximity housing grant of 20,000 Singaporean dollars towards the purchase of a property within 4 kilometers of one's parents' home. European countries can implement such measures to regenerate extended family support structures over time. Next slide, please, Ruben. However, co-location's incentives on their own may be inadequate while rural areas suffer from low economic development. In the UK and France, London and Paris contribute 23% and 30% respectively of their country's GDPs, with high salaries and prestigious jobs causing growing disparities with the regions. Meanwhile, provincial communities see their populations dwindle and public services deplete. Young people piling into urban centres is a catalyst for many of the factors we've discussed. Pressure on housing stock, separation of families, long commutes, anonymised dating markets. Governments need to find ways to incentivise young people to start families in their hometowns while spreading economic opportunities to those areas. One core policy could be encouraging students to enrol in local or regional universities through tuition fee reductions and government bursaries. Companies could also receive tax incentives to hire local graduates. In the UK, the cycle of geographic mobility commonly begins at university, where between 70 and 80% of students leave home to study. By enticing students to stay at home in these important years, they are more likely to put down roots and form networks, ensuring they build livelihoods there. Rural regeneration may be more challenging. Many governments have attempted solutions, for instance, low-tax economic areas or the former UK government's levelling up agenda. Fiscal redistribution in infrastructure and public services to poorer regions is doubtless important, one successful example being Switzerland's policy of national fiscal equalisation, where richer cantons distribute tax receipts to poorer cantons. Other options include utilising benefits of remote working, ushered in at scale during COVID-19. The fact that many workers have jobs which require minimal time spent physically in the office presents opportunities not to mandate worker relocation as the norm. Given that around 75% of employees in the EU work in the services sector, there is ample scope to roll this out. In some ways, the EU is ahead of the curve here, with their 2022 directive on work-life balance giving parents of young children the right to request remote working. However, employers are not obliged to accept. Now, of course, this is a difficult area, as companies also have growth targets and relational priorities which could be compromised by remote working cultures. Also, as discussed, remote working can cause intrusion of work into family time. These concerns are all understandable and a workable balance must be struck with due care. However, what is not arguable is that the present situation is harmful to family time and therefore unsustainable. My personal view is that if the trade-off is between economic growth or quality family time, we should lean towards the latter, particularly given our current crisis. Next slide, please, Ruben. One of the most complicated forces to resolve is delayed adulthood. Given our fertility window remains largely fixed, the increasingly late age of marriage and childbearing inevitably results in lower birth rates. Replacement level birth rates will likely be unattainable unless people start families in their 20s, no matter the progress that IVF makes. Addressing this, however, may require policies that are radical and controversial. The most conspicuous cause of delayed adulthood is the rise in young people attending university. Of course, having an educated workforce is desirable. However, the question must be asked whether the economic needs of society and the needs of the students themselves are best served by well over half of young people completing tertiary education, or whether an economy can reliably create jobs which fit their training. For instance, UK universities produced 40,000 psychology graduates a year, but the need for professional psychologists is scarcely a fraction of this. Now, we must be careful not to deny opportunities that we ourselves enjoyed. Pulling up the ladder would be hypocritical. But governments must pull back from the relentless push towards tertiary education, where lengthy and expensive degrees are required for jobs that previously required only vocational, on-the-job training. Some sectors, like the UK legal profession, have introduced non-university routes to becoming solicitors through apprenticeships. Other industries will be doing similar. A particular challenge is reversing the falling fortunes of young men. Given their lower rates of university enrollment, paired with deindustrialization across much of Europe, men find fewer economic opportunities that provide good wages. As discussed, this has negative downward impacts on dating and starting families. Providing and creating well-paid jobs for such men in skilled manual trades will be key to healing the growing gap between the sexes. Next slide, please, Ruben. Combating demographic decline is an immense challenge. The problem is increasing in severity, and no European country has managed to reverse it, despite serious attempts. The forces of decline are so numerous and potent that successfully tackling them and restoring replacement fertility rate will be a Herculean effort. Politicians across the EU must unite in treating demographic decline as a priority, on par with climate change and national defence. Moreover, they must shift their focus from solely financial measures to counteract the social, cultural, and ideological undercurrents that hinder childbearing. There is ample scope for creativity in a relationship-centered agenda, which recognises that breakdown of institutions like families and local communities has contributed so much to our malaise. By reviving these structures designed by God for nurturing families, we can restore the relational health of our societies. These proposals will require courage, determination, and long-term thinking, but the results we hope and pray will be more than worth it. Next slide, please. And thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Matthew. That's incredibly wide-ranging and some radical thoughts there that you don't hear very often put out in the public space, certainly in the UK. I don't think we have any questions in the Q&A at the moment. So if people would like to write those in, that'd be helpful. Perhaps I could start off with just a question about something you didn't really touch on, apart from Israel, which was the culture of pronatalism. It was striking that when asked about would he seek to do anything to reverse demographic decline in the UK, the current Prime Minister said something like, oh, I wouldn't seek to tell people how to live their lives. The slight problem is that in nearly every other aspect of government policy for the last 15 years in the UK, and including this government, we've had lots of attempts to tell people how to live their lives. And it's just clear that there isn't an appetite amongst the sort of political class to seek to grasp this issue. Now, in some countries, as you said, Italy, Hungary, and so on, there are politicians talking about this. But do we need a sort of root and branch reform of political culture to sort of shift towards a pronatalist sort of outlook?
Yes, I hadn't heard the Prime Minister saying that, but it doesn't surprise me. I think the answer is plainly yes. And I think to start with, I understand the reasons why there's perhaps discomfort. I mean, traditionally, relationships, families, marriage, these have been areas where governments have been uncomfortable to intervene because they see it as the personal realm or the cultural realm where fears of nanny state or whatever it might be have generally led to a hands-off approach. Now, that might be okay where cultures clearly have thriving relationships across society. However, we are now, as perhaps today's discussion showed, entering a radically different world where relationships clearly are broken across society. A lot of that caused by government actions, for instance, those favouring growth above all else or relentless mass migration. But some of them caused by other reasons. Yes, I think at the end of the day, in many countries, the risk is existential, especially if you look beyond to countries like South Korea, which I didn't discuss today. But South Korea has a birth rate of, I think for this year, the estimate is 0.68. Uh, Staggeringly low. I mean, to put that into context, what that means is imagine 20 grandparents. Between them, they will have 7 children, and those 7 children will have 3 children. So within 2 generations, you go from 20 to a cohort of 3, which is that you're talking existential levels of risk, a society not being able to function. So uh, Keir Starmer and other ministers may speak in that way if they wish, but at the end of the day, without responsible leadership from the top, an explicitly pro-natal culture, having a minister for family and governments for every government policy, having reviews of to the extent to which economic policy, immigration policy, whatever impacts families and the birth rate, that's necessary. We need root and branch change in governments, and if you're not willing to show pro-natal a pro-natal culture from the top, well then the country that country will get get the leadership they deserve, unfortunately. So yes, I think leaders like Keir Starmer really need to wake up and smell the coffee.
Seeing no Q&A being written, I'll continue with my own. So to stop me talking, you need to ask a question of your own. The standard response to what you said is that we can just have skilled migration and import workers from abroad and even families. What do you think the pros and cons of that response are to the demographic challenge?
Obviously, immigration is such a central issue in the EU, and the UK has been for the last decade, but especially at the moment. And I think the disruption that can cause to society, where effectively in the UK, where you're adding the size of a large city every year, there's simply no scope to integrate that into a society, and I think that's just going to exacerbate in the coming years. But often, what's not talked about is the damage that causes to societies where these workers are coming from. So, a lot of the migration into countries like the UK comes now from places like sub-Saharan Africa or the Philippines, for instance, in medical workers. Now, um, under the UN, countries like the UK and Germany are not supposed to poach medical staff from countries who can scarce afford to train them up and keep them themselves, but that certainly hasn't stopped us doing that. And I think with the immigration debate, we often look at our own countries, but actually we need to also consider the countries that are left behind, where there are older people who can't get carers because they've gone to richer countries. But I think in many ways, this, given how widespread demographic decline is now, it's quickly going to become a zero-sum game, in that there are an increasing number of societies that are going to require migrant labor, for instance, China, Japan, and South Korea, unless they go for options like robotics. But there's a dwindling number of countries with that demographic dividend that can provide that. So within 20, 30, 40 years, that the scramble for migrants is going to get such that it would be impossible to fill those vacancies at any rate. Now, if countries like the UK or European countries are not able to either increase birth rates dramatically or to find a way of reducing staggering rates of economic inactivity, I think in the UK, the latest number was at 9 million or 10 million or so out of work. If they're not able to use that to fill vacancies, then immigration in the long run will not be even a workable answer, and that's even not even going into the to the other disruptions that mass migration can cause.
Yeah, yes, I think I agree that we often forget the impact on the sending countries. Often they're getting remittances back, so it's a monetary sort of return for exporting your labour force. But obviously that causes all sorts of relational problems. But as you said, many of these countries now are also facing demographic decline, and effectively, from the map you showed, only sub-Saharan Africa now has countries with birth rates well above replacement. And so that's going to be where migrants are going to be coming from if migration continues at its current rate. Still no other Q&A, so I'm not sure whether I've got any more questions off the top of my head. So I think as this is a Christian forum, I think it would be good to just pray about these things and just reflect on the sort of pro-natal theme running through Scripture from Genesis 1 and 2 onwards, that's then reinforced. And so it's sort of, while singleness in the Christian life certainly has a place, the sort of biblical injunction to mankind is to procreate and to continue to do so. That wasn't alleviated or changed either with the covenant with Noah or with the new covenant. And so I think that the worry for politicians, for instance, in the UK, is that if they were to begin to give greater incentives for childbirth, there's a concern that it would bring about bigger families of parts of the population they would be uncomfortable seeing grow in influence, particularly Catholics, evangelicals, and Muslims clearly have higher sort of propensities to have bigger families. And so I think one of the cultural concerns in the UK has been to limit child support to only 2 children per family, in the worry that more generosity would go to parts of the community that sort of secular parts of society don't particularly welcome. So therefore, I shall sort of close us in prayer and pray for countries and our politicians for wisdom in this regard. Father God, we thank you for the instruction and wisdom you give in your word that you've given to Matthew as he's given this instructive talk. We thank you for your wisdom with regard to family, marriage, the need and the blessings of co-location, and how your wisdom seems to solve the problems that our world in its godless wisdom have produced. And so we pray for politicians, leaders, those in government and authority around the world, but particularly in Europe, as they grapple with these questions, some of them willingly and willing to admit the issue, some in denial. We would pray, Lord, that you would give a spirit of openness to thinking about radical solutions that promote marriage, family, rootedness, and that may sacrifice initial economic growth, but in the long run will be of greater benefit to society with deeper relational ties. We know this is a difficult issue for many to grasp, to many to comprehend, how radical things may have to change to produce a turnaround. But Lord, we ask for your mercy on this continent, that you would allow your wisdom to be applied. We pray this for your glory. Amen. So thank you to Matthew and those who've attended. It's been good to have you with us. I'm not quite sure yet when the next Salux and Jubilee Centre webinars are going to be next year, or even their topics, but we'll let you know when they come up. Thank you very much.